Richard to be controversial. So I'm hoping that you guys have some questions for Richard and Andrew. One of the things that struck me is that my children are now 4 and 7, so it's all over.
It's all wrong, yeah.
To concentrate on my marriage instead. Anybody want to share some thoughts or some questions on what they've just heard today? We have some mics coming down to here. If you could say your name and the organisation you're from, that really helps just people to pick up conversation later in today.
I'm going to sit next to you.
Thank you.
Michael Zand from the Health and Safety Executive. Thanks for your talks. I can see the value of using wellbeing measures to target policy interventions, but I'm less convinced about using it to track progress over time. And so 2 issues I can see is, firstly, that obviously the life satisfaction scale is bounded at 10. So going back to the time series you had plotting GDP and life satisfaction over time, it would be impossible for life satisfaction to track GDP because it can't go past 10. And then the second issue I see is that what 10 means also changes over time as what's possible to achieve in life changes over time as well, and it's sort of people assess themselves relative to that kind of moving goalpost. So I wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you. Can we take another question if we've got one ready? Yeah, one over here, please.
Chris Brooks from the UK Health Forum. Thank you for both of those presentations.
Richard's just asked if you could stand up if you're asking a question as well. If you feel comfortable doing that, please do.
Good morning.
Hello, Chris.
Chris Brooks from the UK Health Forum. Both presentations excellent, that goes without saying. One of the things I'm interested in is the distribution of life satisfaction across the population. Traditionally, I'd expect that to be done by socioeconomic status, so whether there's any information on that. And that brings you into thinking about the links between life satisfaction causality and health in terms of social determinants of health causality. So there appears to be an overlay, though I haven't worked out quite to what extent. So that's a double question. One on inequalities, the other on the link to social determinants of health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. We'll take those 2 and have a think about some other ones that you might want to ask. So we had one question about tracking progress over time and the 0 to 10 bounded scale, and one question about distribution of life satisfaction across the population and links between life satisfaction and health social determinants. Who shall I go to first, Richard or Andrew?
Why don't we both answer it? I'll give my answer and you give your answer.
We'll do it at the same time.
Well, I quite agree with you that we can't be sure that the words are used in the same way over time. A similar issue, when we compare countries, we can't be sure that the words mean the same. But the fact is that we can explain these phenomena quite well across countries. You just saw an example at the very end then. Really remarkable. I think the R squared is 0.8. With 6 variables explaining the differences across countries. So there must be some information content across countries. Over time it's slightly more difficult, but you can certainly trace the same people over time. It's less likely that an individual person will change his use of words. It might change across cohorts somewhat. These equations work perfectly well in explaining the variation of a person's self-reports over time. So there's obviously a lot of information content, but it's surely not perfect. I think ultimately the way forward will be to get biomarkers, which are part of the constant human biology. On that, I don't think the boundedness issue is a big issue, not yet. I haven't got there. On the socio-economic issues, of course, and Andrew showed you, there is a social gradient running from parents to children. There's also a social gradient running from one aspect of an adult to another. Causality there is slightly more difficult often, of course, to be sure. But it's an important dimension, but it's not by any manner means the only dimension. And I think that I'm, of course, rather keen that we have a wider view of what's unequal. Inequality of well-being seems to me a more fundamental concept than inequality of income, and the relation between the two exists, but it's not overwhelming. So I want to see us thinking of things like mental health problems, which occur somewhat more. They have some social gradient, but the social gradient explains a very small fraction of the total variance of mental health across people.
Andrew.
Yeah, let me just add to that. The boundedness question is a good one. It's one that we worry about a lot with short scales, where we've got a lot of people stuck at the top. In most of these scales I was showing you, we have fewer than 10% of the people at the top. The GSS is the exception in the US, and the trends we trace out over time are actually the same if we cut off the end people and just look at the percentage of 1 to 9s and things like that. There's no movement there. We don't see any evidence over time that people are shifting into the top categories. And of course, you're absolutely right. Once you're in the top category, there's nowhere to go. The meaning of 10, yeah. I mean, Richard mentioned biomarkers. I would think of neuro evidence, if we can actually think about that, if that's changed over time. Diagnostic measures of stress, cortisol, and so on. I think that's all I had to say. The thing about exogenous movements and causality, I mean, we've been talking about naturalistic evidence so far this morning. Where this literature is going to go, or this approach is going to go, is much more in the use of experiments and randomized control trials where we have some kind of some identifiable exogenous variation. There is some work on that with respect to income and even with respect to status, using natural events where people have lost their jobs, they've lost status and things of that nature. Yes, that's a good point.
Thank you. A couple more questions. I've got one down in the front here and then two up there on the left. So first here, we'll take all three together if that's okay. If you could stand and say your name and organisation, that really helps.
Yes, thanks very much. Simon Strickland, Cabinet Office. Professor Layard, you commented, I think, that safety and security might be treated separately from other areas of policy, but also because of the significant role of anxiety in emotional state, one might expect policies on security, both against natural hazards and other kinds of risks, to be evaluatable in life satisfaction terms. Can you comment on that?
Thank you. And we have a question about safety, security, risk and the role of anxiety.
Ed Palmer from the Office for National Statistics. It's a question, I think, related to a previous one about distribution. Given that we have limited resources in government, should we be equally concerned bringing people from a score from 8 to 9 as from 2 to 3? And there may be issues around sort of equity treatment, diminishing marginal returns, those sorts of things.
So limited resources and where we target those. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Shreya Nanda from the Department for Communities and Local Government. I was wondering, you talked about using the measure in randomized control trials. Do you think there's a problem that, given the measure is subjective, that people might try and game the trial by saying, I like this intervention, so I'm going to report my well-being as artificially high? Or do you think that it will generally work?
So three great questions. Hopefully we'll get a chance to do a few more. So we've got one about measuring safety, security and risk and the role of anxiety measures in that. One about how you target limited resources and whether we care about people who are 9s and 10s, I suppose. And something RCTs and use of subjective measures and would they be gamed?
Right, I could probably have a go at doing the last one first. So I say probably. Of course, it's always possible in an experimental, a pure experimental setting, that individuals will respond either in the way that they think the experimenter wants, or they will respond in a way that they think will give themselves future gain by. And this is one of the points that Bruno Freyer's made, that people will change their answers in order to have policies that they wish addressed to them. So it's a possibility. I don't know if we're quite there in terms of knowing how much this exists. I mean, I would like RCTs, but at the same time, we do have a lot of natural experiments where income changes, where there's a dollop of unemployment, where things happen like Brexit, for example, and nobody could really be accused of gaming their answers. You know, post-Brexit, we actually just finished a paper where we're evaluating the well-being effect of Brexit, which is quite large, actually. It depends on whom, actually. Some people went up, some people went down. I'll let you guess who they were. So, yeah, it's a possibility in a way that is different from doing a randomized control trial and looking at effects on income, for example. Of course, you could get around this by using diagnostic measures. Or take cortisol, something like that that you can't game, but I entirely acknowledge that possibility. Yeah.
There are lots of people who are doing trials and using these measures in the audience, so it might be worth picking that up. If you've done it, have a share of it later.
The question about distribution, of course, music to my ears at least. No, I mean, I do think that there are a lot of powerful philosophical arguments, apart from one's sort of gut feeling, for being more concerned to raise somebody who starts off at 4 to 5 than somebody who starts off at 8 to 9. So I think a quite natural way of thinking about policies is to look at the most miserable people and find out what would be the things which could do the most for them at the least cost. And this is sort of analogous to the way we used to proceed, though this has fallen away a bit, in terms of looking at the number of people in poverty. And we used to say, you know, let's get rid of child poverty. So that would be a simple objective, to move people out of the bottom category, wherever they were in the bottom category, out of it, to wherever they end up above it. And I think that is quite a sensible way. I don't think it's the only way of thinking about policy, because, you know, if you're thinking about building a transport system, it's going to affect a lot of people, and you've got to take it seriously, the fact that it's making all of us lives better in various ways. But I think it's quite stimulating. I wouldn't suggest it as a sort of main way to make policy. It's quite stimulating to think about, as I did at the end of my talk, what would be the biggest levers to abolish misery. And on the question here, as I understand you, you're saying, which is obviously right, that mental illness is caused by all sorts of things, some of which we've already got in that equation, and some of which we haven't. And we should obviously be trying to put up barriers to mental illness as well as treating mental illness. I'm very involved myself in a very big trial in secondary schools of a complete mental health promotion program running once a week for 4 years, the first 4 years of secondary education. A serious evidence-based version of what they call PSHE. I think we should have that. I'm now trying to see if we couldn't do something similar in primary. Mental health promotion is important, and of course all kinds of people have responsibilities. Employers have a responsibility to have an atmosphere which doesn't generate mental illness. They have a responsibility to help people who are suffering from mental health problems, have it made more easy for them to talk about it and to be told what kind of help they can get. So it's an all-round issue, absolutely.
I think people are pretty bad at change. I think the Health and Safety Executive found that change was the biggest risk factor for work for mental health. We can pick up some of these in the debate. I've got 2 more questions here, one lady at the front here, one on the side.
Hiya, Shaila Janamraju, I'm from DFID. A couple of questions. One was, to what extent does the bottom sort of 10% misery quartile affect the aggregate life satisfaction? So is it the case that we should be having policies that focus on the bottom 10%? And I just wondered how sensitive was the poverty aspect if you were looking at developing countries where it would actually be possibly cheaper to lift them out.
Brilliant. So a question about the bottom 10% affecting the aggregate and how sensitive the positive aspect is, particularly thinking about developing countries. Is that right?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask a similar question. I'm also from DFID, but just more generally, I was wondering just any advice on applying this approach to measuring value for money in a developing country context where there might be very limited or weak data.
So applying in a developing country context about value for money where the data may be challenging. Who would like to go first?
Sorry. I mean, on developing countries, the most remarkable and challenging finding, based on 5 separate surveys of happiness in China, is that the Chinese population are no happier now than they were 25 years ago. Now, this is the main story and the end of poverty. I just think it's an absolutely huge challenge to policymakers of all kinds, perhaps especially economists, for having completely neglected the social aspect of development and the impact that it has on family structure, social structure, community. If you make people richer, and we can see the data from the rural-urban migrants in China, if you make people 3 times richer, but they feel lost, they haven't got friends, they're miles from their family, it's not surprising that their happiness doesn't go up. We're actually making the next issue of the World Happiness Report, 2018, on migration, because economists tend to assume that migration is good because it raises world GDP, which it surely does. But does it raise world happiness? This is another very, very deep issue. I think, I'm not sure that your question was different. I think my answer to your question is the same as my answer to the gentleman there, that I think we should focus more on the relief of misery, but I want that life satisfaction to become the way in which we evaluate HS2 as well as other issues.
Andrew, do you want to add?
Yeah.
Perhaps, no, I had one more thing. I got one more thing to say.
Not finished, it's a pause.
Well, Andrew and I and some others, we are going to look really carefully at the effect of income on happiness in countries at different income levels. But the conventional wisdom at the moment, based on the work of Justin Wolfers and Betsy Stevenson, that some of you may know, is that the effect of a doubling of income on happiness is similar across different countries.
Yeah, what do I have to add to that? Let me start with the last question. It's one of the huge regrets, I suppose, of you working in this area, that you end up saying terribly important, huge amounts of things about middle-aged West Germans. I mean, that's just where a lot of our data comes from. Of course, what we want to do is search for the universal truth, the grand unified theory of everything, but for that we need data. And we mostly don't have very good developing country data. We just spent some time in China with one of the research centres there, and we think we're going to be able to make some progress using longitudinal and some kind of cohort Chinese data. Certainly, developing countries are different, and it would be extremely dangerous to try to generalise what we're doing here to every country in the world. There are huge externalities from the kind of growth that has been seen in China in terms of inequality, healthcare, environment, and so on. It's difficult to conclude from that. With respect to the poverty, of course we've been talking about the well-being effects of intervention at different levels of well-being, and we sort of do think that we're a bit Rawlsian and we should look at the bottom more than we look at the average. It's also entirely possible that the cost of an intervention at the bottom is just much smaller than a cost at the top. I mean, it might just be easier to move people out of 3, 4, 5 than it is to move them from 8 to 9. This is something that we're going to have to address as well. Unless we're going to be utilitarian, we need to address the costs of these things.
Yeah, I mean, certainly some areas that I've been involved with, mental health treatment and mental health promotion, it is striking that the effect of a given input is bigger the worse off the person treated was initially.
Right.
Thank you. I've got time for probably 2 or 3 more questions. So I've got one at the front here, one at the back, and then another one down at the front as well. So the lady with the green headscarf, and then the lady with the pink top, and then the guy at the front with the glasses.
Thank you both. Really stimulating presentations. My name is Zara Latif. I work in the Cabinet Office's Open Innovation team. We look to deepen collaboration between academics and policymakers across Whitehall. I'm curious, I think you both alluded to it or mentioned it briefly, how you've considered the possibility that a person's expectations of their own life satisfaction is bounded. So I might wish to be Prime Minister but think it's simply not possible for someone like me. So I wouldn't even consider that as part of the range of possibility for me.
Question about expectations and life satisfaction at the top there.
Hi, I'm Sophie from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So you mentioned a lot about policies kind of going for life satisfaction. But if there was like a new policy that had many benefits for life satisfaction, especially more so in the long term, so kind of intergenerational, with media especially concentrating so much on kind of publishing like the cost of it, like of the project itself, how do you think government can help convey it as a good project to people, as at the moment so many people will see kind of a big figure as to like, is it a good thing or a bad thing?
So longer term impacts and making sure that cost at the front. But one more question just at the front here as well. And then I think that's probably it for this session, but I think the team are around for the rest of the day as well.
Thank you very much. I'm Matthew Mitchell from DCLG again. I had 2 questions actually. I'm going to be very sneaky. I think the first thing is that kind of you mentioned in particular the distinction between using a life satisfaction measure of cost effectiveness against willingness to pay. And I wondered if you mentioned your conversion factors, and I will go away and read your paper with great interest. But I think kind of my question would be whether or not there has been a consideration of willingness to pay for life satisfaction points, and whether or not kind of there's more research in that field and how valuable you think that might be as an area of, to cover. Just because there is willingness to pay evidence that exists, and so much of the analysis that's already been done is on a willingness to pay basis. And my second question was whether or not kind of life satisfaction has been addressed to taxation at all. We've spoken a lot about cost effectiveness today and the fact that government resources are limited, but I wondered if in the same way that kind of more classically economic view might have a view on ideal systems of taxation, whether or not there's a life satisfaction approach to that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Stuck an extra question, always a good way to do it. So we had one question about expectations and life satisfaction, one about being able to communicate the longer term and intergenerational impacts of when you've got upfront cost, and one about willingness to pay and life satisfaction, and one about life satisfaction and taxation.
Gosh, let me. I'm going to do expectations. Who was expectations?
The first question.
Yeah, hi. So the expectations effect on life satisfaction. So this is like it's like a benchmark or a comparison effect. If I evaluate what I get relative to, I can evaluate it relative to my peer group. I can evaluate it relative to you, or I can evaluate it relative to what I expected to get. And this leads to a rather dismal policy conclusion that we should all expect nothing and then we're happy with whatever comes out, which I live in France, so I often say this is the British approach to success. You know, we just assume nothing is going to work, and yeah, mostly it doesn't, but that's okay, because we didn't think it was going to anyway. But you you can't really push that sensibly as a policy intervention. I think there are a couple of things. One is that we care about process utility. We not only care about what happens to us, we sort of care about how it comes about as well. And my gut feeling here is getting something done, even if you didn't think you could do it, is much more satisfying than going shopping in the evening and coming back with shopping, because you knew you could do that. That's not a problem. But how I can incorporate that into the kind of work we're doing, I am not sure. Most of the time we don't know what people think they're capable of, what they expect. The only thing I can think of in this area is actually one rather nice explanation for, you may know the U-shape in well-being, the happiness smile. I'm going up again, by the way. You're probably going down, but what can I do? We don't know what that reflects. One piece of work that speaks to this asks people, what do you expect is going to happen to you over the next 5 years? How happy do you think you're going to be in 5 years' time? And then 5 years later, we interview the same people, because we interview them every year, and we can see whether they were right. And young people are systematically optimistic. They're pessimistic. They think it's going to be great. It's not. And then at about 45, it equals out. You get what you think you're going to get. And then in older age, it turns out much better than you thought it was going to be. And that might be an explanation of why this happens. But how I can introduce that for policy purposes, it's something that at some point we're going to have to deal with. I don't know how to address it. What else were we talking about here? Which one do you want to do?
Well, I'll say something about the future.
Yeah.
The future is obviously the issue, and the technical issue is the discount rate. Obviously we have, when we're doing cost-benefit analysis in units of money as a unit of benefit, we use a discount rate which has two components. One is what they call the pure time discount rate. That's the fact that something is in the future and we don't really quite know. We can't kind of quite know about it, and we might not be here, and any of that. The other is the discounting coming from the declining marginal utility of income, because future generations will be richer. Well, that's irrelevant, of course. The second of those is irrelevant when we're measuring outcomes in units of well-being anyway. So we should use the pure time discount rate. that's what we recommend, which I think the Treasury have as 1.5%, which means the future is pretty important. If anybody is thinking now, what about the social opportunity cost of capital, I won't bore everybody by
Pick that up in the lunch break.
commenting on that. Somebody who's worried about that can come and talk to me about it. Second issue that was raised was the relation between willingness to pay measurement and measurement in units of well-being. Obviously, the link between the two is the marginal utility of income. I would like to say very clearly here that I am not opposed to the use of willingness to pay as a way of thinking about policy evaluation in areas where it's feasible, which includes parts of government policy, certainly education, R&D, some industrial policy, even transport. Aspects of transport can be done that way, though it's difficult to handle the distributional side of it. But what I'm saying is that in whole areas we simply can't use it, and we'll have to use the approach that I've been advocating, and we're advocating, that the What Works Centre is advocating. Now then you might say, well, how do we draw the boundary between these two? And that'll have to be done by a political process. We can't do that by actually using the marginal utility of income to allocate between these two methods of decision making any more than we can use any of this process, I think, to decide the total size of government expenditure. That's why we're always focusing, and we are this afternoon, I think, focusing our analyses on what's the best value for money for a given expenditure, rather than enabling this process to somehow determine the total amount of expenditure. On taxation, I mean, the first thing I ever wrote on this in 1980 was pointing out that if the finding, which has now been confirmed by our work and many others, that people suffer from an increase in income by other people, that is a negative externality. And we normally say as economists that a negative externality calls for a corrective tax. This means that when we tax the income which results from a person working harder, a part of it is actually not a distorting tax, but a corrective tax. And therefore, we shouldn't be so obsessed with the alleged distortions arising from rates of taxation, because probably a part of the marginal rate of tax is actually performing a positive function rather than a negative and distorting function.
I'm going to have to stop you there. Or do you want to?
Yeah, the only thing I could add
quickly
to that is, of course, we can use the life satisfaction approach to value the public goods that taxation buys. I mean, it's very simple to say we don't like tax because we like money, though there is a relative component. We can also evaluate the public goods. In terms of tax systems, there is one nice piece of work I know internationally that's compared progressivity of tax systems. So this is comparing marginal rates at different points of the income distribution and average life satisfaction within countries, finding actually quite unsurprisingly that given their own level of income, people are in favour of progressive tax systems and dislike more regressive or flatter tax systems. So there is some input that we can get from taxation.
Thank you both, Richard, Andrew. That's really interesting, actually. And I think there's more questions that people wanted to ask. And Richard and Andrew and the team will be around during the day. So please do engage in conversation with yourself and with them and the colleagues. It'd be fantastic. I think I'm in that pit of realism in my 40s. So this is going to be fun and games.